Hi, welcome to this week's Creative Conversations for LCI Melbourne. This week, we're going to meet John Clements, one of the partners for Jackson Clements Burrows, award-winning architectural firm. Let's go see his beautiful house. John, thank you for having me in your house today. How are you going?
Pleasure, Mike. Great to see you.
I think we've scored a pretty nice day to be sitting in your new house in Richmond, the divided house.
Yeah, it's always nice when the sun is shining.
Yeah, something that I've noticed in a lot of your architecture, and I remember you saying to me once, it's not how much light that you have, but it's what you do with it. And the first time that I walked into this place, it was something that I really, really picked up on, was just the way that it's got this amazing, beautiful comfort in the place, and a lot of it's to do with the way the light just filters through.
Yeah,
is that
thanks.
important in everything that you do?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think light and architecture have a really important relationship, obviously. And this house has, it benefits from a north orientation, so you can track the sun movement over the course of a day and how the building responds to it. So yeah, there's a lot of consideration in this house sort of throughout the design about solar orientation and how different spaces. We've actually even explored dark spaces in this house, which are lighter in the morning and then darker in the evening, and yeah, so it's a moody house.
Yeah, I noticed the first time that I walked around was especially in the stairwells, that you go through these beautiful kind of dark areas in the stairwells, and then that opens up into these other sort of spaces. So it's called the divided house. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's quite a large house for Richmond, I guess is one thing, and we've got two kids, two boys who are in their late teens. We probably wanted a house that could give us kind of separation and togetherness, if you like. So it's sort of essentially two houses connected by the space that we're sitting in at the moment, which is sort of a reference to the old lean-to that used to be on the site with the building that preceded this one. It's about sort of being able to occupy our own space and then come together in a kind of in a family living space. But we also kind of understood that maybe down the track, if the kids leave home or whatever, that maybe we don't need as much room as this, and that our lives might change and we might want to be in a smaller house. So rather than the idea of moving, the house is actually designed to be able to be separated or divided into two houses, and we could, obviously put someone in the rear house and we could just live in the smaller front house or sell off half the house. It just gives us flexibility down the track.
Wow, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. You did win a national or a state interior architecture award for this house.
Yeah.
And I completely understand that. I mean, walking through the house and sort of seeing just the consideration that's gone into all of your joinery, like you've got I'm looking at it here, which looks like probably a 6 metre long bench in the kitchen, which is probably where you and your family spend 8 metres.
Yeah.
All right, just to clarify, yeah.
Yeah, that's a record for me.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. Made out of Australian hardwood, and what's the other? Is it oak or?
There's Vic. It's just the house has only got two timbers in it, which are a Vic Ash or Tassie oak, which are a similar timber, and then the spotted gum from New South Wales.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And then you've got that contrasted with sort of like this really bespoke brickwork which runs through, which you also won an award for. What was that award?
Oh, that was the Think Brick Award. It won the residential category, a national award for the use of brickwork in architecture.
Yeah, and then the beautiful, your speckled concrete tiles, but everything, this contrast of those different materials, and then with your absolutely incredible collection of artworks. I mean, it's like an art gallery walking in here. It's like every corner you go to, there's something else there.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we had a lot of the art before we had the house, so and we, you know, we're having a eclectic mix of artwork that we've collected over a period of time. It's mainly Australian contemporary art, but we had, you know, I mean, I had certainly very strong ideas about how certain pieces might be included in the house and where they might be appropriate in the context of the spaces that they exist, and then also thinking about the representation of the work and the backdrop to the work, you know, because as you know, artwork can look very different depending on the backdrop. So, and there's a mixture of materials on the walls in this house, which provides different ways of thinking about how you represent the art. And the sort of the front half of the house is all a very smooth zero finish render, which is a light grey colour, very similar to concrete, but provides a beautiful backdrop to the artwork that's hung in that space, including one of yours over the dining table.
Well, that's how we met, you know,
through
that. I think that love of art is something that kind of allowed us to get to meet each other originally. I know that, you know, I've also seen the farm that you've got out in Lara, and I remember going out there and seeing your studio out there, or at least seeing some of the paintings that you've done also. And so I remember, I always get this feeling that your first passion is the art, and then the architecture was something that grew out of just a natural creative nature. Were you always creative?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good observation, because I sort of didn't grow up wanting to be an architect. But I think you have a natural ability to draw, or you don't. You're blessed with it, or you're not. And I was, you know, I was a capable artist when I was young, and I had a great interest in that, and that's what I explored. That was what, you know, probably really provided the foundation for me getting through kind of my secondary schooling, was my interest in art. I did really well in art and was exhibited in the, you know, what's the equivalent of the top arts exhibition now, for oil paintings that I did at the time. And I've been very interested in portraiture, done a number of portraits. And so that was sort of, you know, I guess that's a connection. Yeah, the creative aspect of it was a connection with architecture. I actually wanted to be a pilot when I was at school, so that was sort of where I was interested. That's kind of, you know, I have a three-dimensional brain, and that's kind of, I think, partly associated with that interest. But I chose to do architecture. My grandfather was an architect, and it sort of was in the family, so it was something that was familiar to me, I guess. But I also loved making things. You know, I was always building things when I was young, you know, mucking around in the workshop, and, you know, built billy carts and things like that.
Yep.
And I think the idea of using your hands and the combination of creativity, it's a natural kind of, you know, transition to move into architecture, because it kind of provides so many different ways of working in the creative space.
Yeah. We could talk about flight for, like, probably flying for the next 3 hours.
We won't go down that rabbit hole.
But I can say that you've taken me out in your plane once, and all the colour drained out of my face pretty quickly. But, you know, that was a good experience. I think my wife enjoyed it more than I did. You know, I've never been good with flying.
You know, I do. I mean, that's the thing that I do to kind of get away from work. It's kind of my form of meditation.
Scare your
you know,
friends.
and how I generated an interest in your work. You know, partly, you know, because your work has, you know, has represented aviation in some of its aspects, and the work Fighter Pilot 1 that we've got in the dining room. You know, so I had a connection with the work, you know, through my interest in aviation and art and portraiture. So,
So you've gone from being creative when you're young to following a direction in architecture, and you've actually become probably one of the most celebrated architects in Australia. You were the national president for Architects Institute, and you're a partner in Jackson Clements Burrows, which is one of the most important architecture firms in the country. How did that start out?
Yeah, thanks. Well, that's pretty generous representation. But look, we've enjoyed great success through architecture. You know, but it's been a lot of hard work. I sort of got a kind of interesting background. I wasn't a model student, so I wasn't the person getting the sort of high distinctions. I kind of just steered my way through university, but I left and I studied and lived down on the coast with architects at Barwon Heads. I lived in a coastal village, a small community, and I think the great benefit of that was being in a diverse community, not being at college, at university with a certain kind of demographic, if you like. I mixed with all sorts of people, tradies, people doing all sorts of different things, living down on the coast, worked in a hotel. Met everyone because I worked in the public bar, so it was a kind of very social student environment to be in, and also very independent. We all lived down on the coast together and we all had jobs to pay our way through university. And that was a really good grounding for architecture because, I think the danger in architecture is that people get kind of overly comfortable with the idea as the architect as the leader of the creative process, and I think I can say that architects do have egos to some degree, and it's an important part of the confidence in which they work. But I think it's also so important that architects have a very grounded understanding of everyone that contributes to the creative process. Down to the labourer who's sweeping the broom across the building site. So, and being able to relate across all those levels is kind of really important. And it's been a kind of important foundation to our success in terms of how we built the practice, the culture of the type of people that we employ, and the kind of the culture that we try to develop where, we're collaborators and we work with other people to deliver a creative outcome that's a sort of team effort rather than representative of any given individual or designer as such. Anyway, so I left, I sort of studied at Deakin Uni, and then I moved to Melbourne and I started working for Darryl Jackson Architects. And Tim Jackson, my business partner, is Darryl's son, and we met while I was working at Darryl's, and I was given great freedom in that practice, and great exposure across different aspects of practice, and great responsibility. And Graham Burrows as well was working in Darryl's at the time. And to cut a long story short, the three of us had a kind of unique bond. We worked on a couple of projects together and felt that there was a natural fit between us. And the three of us are very different personalities and characters, and we brought different networks of opportunity in terms of bringing work into a practice if we formed a practice together. I think I was 27 or 28 years of age when we started JCB back in 1998, I think it was. And I guess, we just started with the three of us, set up a small studio, worked very hard for 3 or 4 years doing all the work ourselves, the design, the documentation, the site visits. But then, over the course of time, we obviously just built up the team, and here we are 22 years later, I guess, 22 years later with nearly 100 people in the practice, which has been great. And I think, that the strength the strength of the three of us has been the ability to work with each other, to kind of respect each other and the people that work in our team, but also none of us are seeking the sort of individual identity through the practice. I think we've always felt that we can learn from each other, and maybe we did work a little bit differently when we started, but over the course of time we've influenced each other, influenced other people in the practice, and now there's a sort of a collective comfort in terms of the way that we work creatively. Some projects we're very closely involved together, and on other projects we're probably more separated or work in our individual ways. But it's the DNA of the practice seems to come out in the work naturally from that process.
Well, also looking across the different projects that you worked on, and everything from primary schools to tertiary institutes to apartments, like all kinds of commercial and residential sort of projects that you've worked on. I think there's a nice visual language which is kind of consistent through them. They're always changing, but there's certain elements which I seem to pick up on in terms of the way that you choose different materials, and also maybe push boundaries in terms of what things look like. But there's not, you can see a story running through there visually, and I think that's really great. What if I was to sort of ask you is there a style that you think, is there something that you could use to define what the style of JCB is?
I wouldn't say there's a style. I mean, I think that's the thing is we don't have a predetermined idea about what any project will be. Like it's very much about understanding a combination of the sort of aspirations and vision of the client, and then understanding the context of the project location itself and the kind of the history of the site, whether it be Indigenous or otherwise, and how we might, I guess, recognise or generate a story and conceptual ideas through a combination of those factors. So it's not predictable, but we have a certain way of working which tends to produce outcomes that come from a similar position. So some people say our work's very recognisable, and maybe from our side of the fence, so to speak, it seems less predictable, but people do, sort of can tell when a project, has come from JCB, seem to be able to recognise them pretty readily, but it's not always the case.
Yeah, there's not a lot of just square boxes there, though. Like everything's
no.
Everything's got.
There's not. There's some things we do. Some things we know that a particular conceptual framework lends itself from one project to another. So we might take the conceptual framework, but it's the process that always produces the sort of the outcome. And if the process is rigorous, we always believe that we'll be producing something interesting and unique rather than sort of reproducing a position or a typology.
I think the thing which I think is the joining factor between all of the different projects you've worked on is the consideration of the inhabitant of the space, the person who's going to use that space.
Yeah.
So maybe visually there's it really changes over time, but in terms of the way that the users, I think that's always key central point of who's going to use the space, how they're going to use it and how they're going to enjoy it and get the most out of it.
Yeah.
I think that must be a really important factor for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's we sort of put priority on the planning of any project and sort of, how do spaces work? How do we build in efficiency? How do people experience space? And we don't differentiate interiors from architecture. We see them kind of as an integrated whole. So we have a large interiors team in our office, but we work as one team.
Yeah.
And, we like to think that in most cases, the interior of our buildings has a relationship with the exterior of the buildings, whether that be through materials or otherwise, strategy. But yeah, from our point of view, that's really important, that a project kind of delivers a whole rather than, if you like, just an aesthetic. It's sort of very much about the functional aspects of buildings, and that's really important in terms of the engagement with client aspiration and vision too, is actually getting the client into that process and helping them understand opportunities in terms of different ways that you might deliver a building or plan a building, just working through strategies. So.
Well, that's where the story is so important, I think, in architecture, that you're not just creating this thing which is going to be used by someone, but it's also you're creating. I think the story is important. I think it's important for art. It's important for any kind of design, really, is that the thing which connects someone to a space emotionally and not just from a practical sense of perspective. Is there a project which is sort of like the one that you're warmest to? Like, what's the one that you look back and you go, that's the project that I just really love?
Oh, I mean, I couldn't not say that I don't love this project the most, but I put the most love into this project. It's my own home, and it, combines our interest, in art and architecture, and it's in a location that we've lived for 15 years, and we love being here. But we've got projects in the office that that we're kind of fond of because of their success for different reasons. But different projects deliver different outcomes. Like an interesting project is maybe the Icon in St Kilda, the Lego building, as it's referred to. It's a series of coloured stacked blocks, and it's quite a polarising project in the community.
You can't miss that building.
And I actually love going past that building in a taxi because I always ask the taxi driver what they think of the building, without saying that we designed it. And I love the different responses you get. And there's definitely, some people love it and some people hate it. And it's a building that's interesting because it's a developer-led building, but it involved an artist, Matthew Johnson, you know, whose piece of his work's actually sitting behind you, and you can see some of the colours of that building in it. Matthew was very involved in sort of the generation of the colour scheme for that building, which is not only external, it's internal as well. And the colours were about the vibrancy of St Kilda and the sort of St Kilda culture. And if people understand the building on a deeper level, they tend to have a stronger appreciation for it. And it's a bit like art, you know. Some people look at art just from an aesthetic perspective, but if you actually understand sort of where the art's come from conceptually, sometimes you have a completely different experience of it. But that building, yeah, is interesting because it's a developer-led project, and it's not perfect by any means. You know, we didn't document the building at the end. We handed over the building to the developer, who had a kind of documentation team who did some of the work at the end. And it's probably not executed quite at the level that we would like a building to be executed, but by the same token, it delivers on the concept, you know, and it delivers on the story. And I think it's just a really interesting marker in St Kilda, and it's a really interesting kind of counterposition to other buildings that have been done in the location, and the potential of architecture to be thought of from a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you've done some. It's a phenomenal building. It's actually, I mean, you cannot miss it. It's right there. It's different from everything else, and it makes a statement. And I think that's what's really important about it. That, it's definitely a polarised view. And I love that idea that you ask the taxi drivers what they think of it, because you know, they're not going to know who you are, and it's probably a really good way to get feedback.
No one knows. I mean, that's, you know, like, I think there's a few architects around who'd like to think that people know who they are, but no, you're unknown as an architect. So it's really nice when you know, when you're in an environment where you've got a building in the street and you can see people appreciating it. And, you know, I've had great conversations with people out the front of this house, just people who are intrigued by the house, and I can get into a conversation with them without talking to them about being the architect. Just, you know, just the homeowner, if you like.
Yeah.
But
that's great.
Yeah, but you know, it's really nice to get that kind of exposure to how people respond to buildings, and for good or for bad. You know, actually, I love hearing from people about why they don't like a building, because it just influences your kind of your greater thinking around architecture and people's different experiences of it.
Yeah, amazing. There's this, out of all the buildings that I've seen of yours, you know, large and small, one of them that I just really love is the, I think is it the Lawn Bowls Club, which is down on the way to Frankston?
Yeah, Seaford.
Seaford Lawn Bowls Club, which is just, it's just beautiful. It's not what you would expect for a Lawn Bowls Club to be.
Keith Park Community Centre.
It feels like it just kind of goes from that park there with the beautiful green grass, and just almost kind of like evolves into where the beach is.
Yeah,
you know,
it's a really interesting context, because, you know, like lawn bowls has a connotation. You know, people see it as old people in their white kit, sort of, you know, that's what they imagine lawn bowls to be. And bowls clubs have become more progressive in terms of their thinking. You know, I think they have barefoot bowling on one night a week down there, or certainly over summer they do it, and everyone just goes in casual clothes and hangs out and has a few beers on the lawn, so to speak. But the building, you know, the building's a really interesting kind of divider and connector between the lawn bowls and then the nature of Keith Park itself. We worked with Side Office Landscape Architects on that project. And that's a really good example of a building that deals with a kind of set of complex conditions, the relationship to the beach, relationship to landscape, the park, and then the kind of the more controlled environment of the lawn bowls. And it just, you know, I guess the building is there to mediate all of those aspects. It's got a scout club underneath it, and or Sea Scouts, I think it is, that are occupying the bottom of the building. But it's really about a building that's about people. And in fact, the photos our best photos of that project are just people loving that building and the space and the kind of the community aspect of it. Yeah.
So does a project like that, do you see that as sort of like a passion project for for JCB?
I mean, we love doing small community buildings. They can be challenging at times.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're doing we've just completed a surf lifesaving club. We've completed a surf lifesaving club South Melbourne. That's a lifesaving club, not surf lifesaving club, because it's on the bay. But yeah, there's no surf there. But we've done a surf lifesaving club at Point Lonsdale recently. And again, they're buildings that are very that work hard for the community, and they become sort of gravitational centres for the community, if you like. So the importance of how the architecture facilitates the gathering of people, and the sharing of space and stuff is really important. That's something that we really enjoy working on those projects, and we try to have a diverse sort of range of projects within the office at any given time, because we learn from different spaces. There's things you learn from multi-residential architecture that you can apply some of that thinking even into community buildings. You learn about different efficiencies, different systems and stuff like that. So whilst some building types might seem completely unrelated, it's sort of underneath it there's subversive stuff that actually influences our thinking around different projects. And residential is a good example where it's a great learning space in terms of looking at detail at a smaller scale, having young architects involved in work, at the sort of more hands-on scale, and then taking the learnings from that kind of consideration of detail at a more focused level, and then taking that up into larger buildings and seeing where you can translate detail into larger buildings rather than overlooking design opportunities that might be small. Yeah.
Coming back to this house again, and sort of like thinking about the things we've just talked about in terms of the story, the love of space, the people who have been in the space, and also that love of art. I know that there's an interesting story about this place when you bought it, and that transition from sort of pulling down the old house to here, and how I feel like you showed respect to the house and what it was by including the Australian artist Ian Strange in the process. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, we've worked with Matthew Johnson previously. We've worked with a couple of different artists in architecture, and we think there's a great relationship that can exist between art and architecture, and we enjoy the kind of, I guess, the creative inspiration that comes from those processes. Liz and I lived across the road at number 50 Clifton Street, and which is a heritage building, and there's quite a well-preserved heritage street, so there's not really, most of the buildings are protected in the street. Anyway, and we were about to renovate that building. I was just about to put it in for planning approval, actually, and then Maria, who lived in the house that preceded this house, passed away unexpectedly. She was fairly old, and she lived on the site for 50 years. In fact, she lived here in there was a preceding house to the house that she was in at the time, but with her husband they built a house in about 1970, so it was going on 50 years old. It was a very nondescript brick veneer, but still had the same interior from the day it was built. And it was tired, and it was a complex building to renovate and retain. But when it came up for sale, because it's a non-contributory building, we could see it would be demolished, and that whoever purchased the site might develop the site, because it's quite a large site. And we had some concern about the potential for someone to come in and develop apartments, for example, on the site, and felt that we'd like to see the street preserved. I guess because we'd lived here for 8 years, we had an idea about what the street was about. So we made a decision to kind of, if you like, shelve our plans for 50 Clifton Street and to purchase this property, and that would give us the opportunity to build a new house, and sort of, I guess, make a contribution to the street and sort of protect the integrity of the street for the future. So that sort of, our plans changed fundamentally around that. But because we lived here and, we knew Maria, and I used to chat to Maria, regularly in the street, we also had a bit of a connection with the house, and we lived in it for a few weeks, while we were moving out of the other property. And we were to demolish it. If I hadn't been demolishing it, someone else would have been. And there's questions around that from a sustainability point of view, and there's questions around that just from how you interpret heritage, relative to the fact that there was a heritage overlay. And then how you think about heritage, from a longer point of view, prior to sort of colonial occupation of Richmond, and all of those things were playing into our minds. And Ian Strange was doing some really interesting work, particularly in the US, about identifying houses that were sort of, coming up for demolition, and often big areas of houses being demolished. And he'd done some really interesting work in terms of installations and documentation through art of the history of those places. And I found that incredibly interesting work, which influenced my thinking around here. So I reached out to Ian. I had actually been communicating with him on a number of things around architecture and art with the Institute. So I was really interested in the work that Ian was doing and how he was documenting these houses that no longer existed. And I think art was a really powerful medium for kind of interpreting history and in a way capturing history in a meaningful way. So when we were to demolish this house, I kind of felt like, given I had this emotional connection with it, I had was asking myself questions around sustainability and heritage. I thought it would be nice to capture that house because it was, the sort of house that most people wouldn't notice, would drive by, and it's like, I'd be good if that house was demolished. But I think every house tells a story, and Ian's work is really about that. So I asked Ian if he'd be interested in, utilising the house for a piece of work before we demolished it, so that Ian had the opportunity to capture that story. And so, Ian did an installation on the house, and he actually put an exhibition inside the house, which is the first time that he's done that. And it was a project was done in combination with RMIT and City of Yarra, and there was a number of people who contributed to the project and were involved. And then he opened the exhibition over a weekend, which I think it went for 3 days, maybe from Friday through to Sunday, and 2,000 people came through the exhibition. And it was the first time Ian had also connected with, communicating his work through social media, actually embracing social media as a strategy, and it worked very successfully for him. And that was a really, that felt meaningful, or certainly to me and to Liz, in terms of embracing Ian's, ideas, capturing the work in a meaningful way. And then I purchased a piece of the work from Ian, which now is in the front of this house.
It's the first thing you see when you walk through the
so
door.
you walk in the front door and the first thing you see is the house that preceded this one. So it's like the first thing we're doing is saying that there's a kind of history on the site. And actually before you get to that, you come to a bench seat on the front wall, and it's got a statement on the bench seat which says Taranut Utbani, which is in the Bunurong language is a traditional gesture to say you're welcome to come into the campfire, and it's such a welcoming gesture, and it recognises the indigenous history of the site. But it says you're welcome to come into the campfire and sit down, share food and share a story. So that's kind of your first introduction to the house. And then you have that layer of Ian Strange's work, which talks to the sort of more multicultural aspect of Richmond, and the sort of post-war occupation of Richmond. And then now you have this home that we sort of hope that we here for a longer period of time. And that piece won't leave the house. It'll be left in the house sort of as part of the history of this site. So if we ever leave this home, we probably wouldn't take that piece of work with us. That would stay as a permanent installation, and hopefully someone who appreciates this house for what it is will understand the story behind that work, and it'll retain its location.
Yeah. So from a perspective of, I'd say, an artist and architect who, has had it's funny, I felt like you played it down before, but you've had some really amazing success in your career, and it comes out of such hard work. Nothing like that comes without that hard work. The people who are going to be watching this recording will be a lot of young designers and artists. What advice would you give to a young designer? They don't need to be an architect, they could be anything. From a young creative person, what would you say to them for starting their career?
I think the one thing is that you have, and this is not about architecture, but it's about creativity in general. It's never easy, yeah? So you have to commit to understanding what your own expectations are, and understanding where you flex your freedoms as a creative. So like if I use architecture, for example, if you think you're just going to go and design buildings however you want to and disregard client, sort of input and vision and aspirations, you're going to have a very difficult time doing it. Firstly, there are projects that we have where we probably have more creative opportunity, and there are projects where we have less creative opportunity. But what's important to us is that we get the most out of the process in terms of creative thinking, and that we accept that it will always be hard work if we want to get the most out of the process. So we work hard to get the best outcomes, and I think you can apply that across any creative space. I mean, if I talk to graphic designers, artists, or otherwise, there are times when you'll have more freedom, and there are times when you'll have less freedom, and you need to learn not to be upset about the times when you feel the most challenged. In fact, I'd probably say that your success might be built on your ability to adapt to the most difficult situations and to flex and to find a new pathway or an alternative pathway that's a better fit for whoever's involved, in terms of, I guess, unpicking or resolving the challenges or issues at play. And in architecture, that happens all the time. It's like you might have designed a beautiful house for a client and you think they're going to love it, and you put it in front of them and you can just tell straight away it just doesn't gel well with them. You have to be prepared to think, well, maybe there's another way of doing this. And you have to be prepared to have that challenging conversation, actually understand where the client feels challenged. And you've got to work out whether you need to go in a completely different direction or you need to challenge the client to be a little bit more, ambitious, or to drop their guard a little bit, So I guess, and that happens all the time. I mean, I think creativity comes hand in hand with, negotiation. It's like a really big part of what we do is negotiating outcomes, but doing it through a creative thinking process.
I think there's an art form in that process in its own right, which is, it's very easy to go, well, whether it's easy or not, you can create whatever you like for yourself, I feel, but there's a real great art form and a really great skill with working within creative constraints, and if you can get that right, and if you lean into it, where you go, that's the challenge that I really enjoy, which is working out how do I deliver to the client the thing that they're going to absolutely love. And I think when you get that right, there's something to be really proud of there.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to do.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, look, it's when people enjoy what you do and you see their emotional reaction to the outcomes, it's extraordinary. But I also think, sometimes the best work comes out of a challenged space rather than a free space. Sometimes if it's too easy, maybe you haven't challenged yourself enough as well. So sometimes the challenges that people bring to the table can lead to interesting solutions or a different way of thinking about a project. And so we always sort of say that, constraint is an opportunity ultimately, and being challenged just creates opportunities, and we sort of try and discover what those opportunities are through the testing process.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, none of your designs look constrained at all. They all seem to break boundaries of what you'd expect from architecture, and they all seem to do something where there's surprises in every corner, and this beauty of discovery as you go through. And I know that when we present this video, there'll be all these great shots of all the corners and nooks and crannies of this house, and there's just, I loved it walking around this the first time. It was like every time you'd turn a corner, you'd find some way that the light had been used, or the way that you'd painted a surface one colour, or you just really subtly allowed the timber to come through in certain areas. But there was no sense of, all right, this is just, I think it was, you said something earlier, which was, you want people to be able to discover something in the work when they see it.
Yeah. I mean, this is a house that sort of does involve discovery. There's a lot of small moments of design in this house, which
Yeah.
is, and I have an interest in making and detailing, and I've got an interest in kind of mechanical things and levers and stuff like that. So there's little moments of exploration that we might not explore in other projects, we might in the future. There's devices that I've designed specifically for this house that will become possibly repeated details, whether it be door handles or levers that open screens or little ventilation slots that I've introduced to some of the window systems to avoid having flow-eye doors and things like that. Those things will translate across to other projects. But
it's the billy cart maker in you.
Yeah, I think so, and I think not everyone will do it, but I think when you have the opportunity to do a house like this, if you're fortunate enough to be in that position, I think it's an important opportunity, and that I've kind of I've used it as a way of exploring my own capabilities, but also what I've learnt within our practice, in terms of how I've translated it through the house. And it's a house that I love bringing people into. People just really enjoy walking through it and exploring it. And you mentioned the sort of idea of the gallery. A couple of people have said they feel like they're coming into a gallery. I mean, I think the art is what gives you that sense of experience, the way the art's represented in the house. But I did imagine it as a space where we would entertain people, and that I might entertain clients, that I'd have team members over, from the office, and that's a space that we kind of want to share with people as opposed to it being a very private space. So it is a semi-public space. And when Tim Ross did his Man About the House show a couple of weeks ago here, my studio space downstairs, we cleared that out and were able to sit 60 people and do a talk inside the house. And it was a wonderful experience just sharing the house with the people, and it worked really functionally from that point of view. So, so I kind of, hope it continues to get used in that way.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to say a huge thank you for having us here today, and to be able to enjoy your place, and thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, pleasure, Mike. It's always good to see you.